And here we go.
Here we go. Okay. Welcome to everybody to History Matters. And I have to do this because it's a ritual and so does coffee. Welcome on a day that I gather from looking at chat that it's not very nice weather in a lot of places. It's definitely not great here. Newbie is very chatty today and I don't know why. Today we're going to talk about, as promised, on a variety of websites and on my Twitter feed, we're going to talk about representation and actually, in a sense, representatives, which is a topic I decided on before we had a big mess this week about Mexico and a certain senator. So that just happened along after I picked the topic. But what I really do want to talk about is representatives and what we've assumed they're supposed to do and some of how that's changed over time. But before I begin, I will now offer the screen to my partner in crime, Matt, who will offer the rules of the game.
And welcome everybody to another great week. We are deep into season 2 at this stage, and this is going to be a great conversation today. So we're really looking forward to it. Rules of the game are as follows. Please use the chat function to discuss whatever happens to be on your mind. Everything from where you're at and the weather to things much more germane to the conversation. We just ask that you please keep it family friendly. If you do have questions for Joanne or myself, in the rare occasion somebody wants to hear my opinion, please feel free to put those in the Q&A. That's where we get our questions from. It's a lot easier to keep track of, folks. There's a lot of activity that goes on in chat during these conversations, so please make sure that you're putting those in Q&A so we don't miss your really important questions. Other than that, if you do like what we do here at the National Council for History Education, please join us. You can go to our website, www.ncheteach.org, and look around, check out all the great content. We have everything from webinars to other great content. A couple items I want to just toss out there. We have a big conference coming up. Beginning of April. We're really looking forward to that. That's going to be a really exciting time. Great conversations, great keynotes, great events, including and not limited to History Matters and So Do Cocktails, which we're looking forward to on April 8th. So save the date, April 8th at 8:30, I believe is what we said, p.m. Eastern time for History Matters and So Do Cocktails.
I have to say though, Matt, you didn't add the important piece of information which is that's basically the 1-year anniversary.
Yes, this is going to be that will be our 1-year anniversary of the show. So it coincides really nicely. There may be cake, I don't know, but we'll have to see how that all plays out. So, but it should be actually a lot of fun. I'm really looking forward to that. Other events we have coming up is I just want you all to save the date for March 10th. That's our big event with Sarah Vowell. We're really excited to bring her in. I got to meet her last week and talk a little bit about what she's going to talk about. It's going to be a lot of fun. That's moderated by Leanne Potter from the Library of Congress. So if you don't know Leanne, she is amazing and terrific. So the registration is open for that now. You may do so at our website, www.ncheteach.org/webinars is where you can find Sarah Vowell's talk. So I think that's it from my end, but please let me know if you have any questions along the way. Thanks.
I will say something which I take no responsibility for because I don't know what it is, but Annie says to tell folks to check chat for our new History Matters bingo cards.
Oh my gosh, now I have to scroll through chat and find those.
I will not look at it because it will take away my concentration, but during the after party, I will. So we now have History Matters bingo card. I love you guys. I truly do. And Carolee, but I love you guys. Okay. And Newbie,
fantastic community here.
Newbie, for some reason, noobs. Thank you. Okay. So let's do this. Okay. So today we are, now I just dawned on me that it's a bingo card for while I'm talking. Oh man, I know some of the things that are on that card. Contingency, accountability. I'm not going to think about it. I'm going to move chat away. Okay. So welcome. As I said, we're talking about representation, representatives. That involves, by definition, voting. And that word that I do talk about all the time, and I will start right off with accountability. And all of these things, voting, representation, accountability, obviously are the heart and the soul of a democratic politics. Now, that has never operated in a perfectly ideal way. There has never been a sort of golden age of politics, as much as we really want there to be one. However, we will see some of how this worked in the past, some of how that's changed over time, and that'll maybe give us a sense of really how representation and really democracy is supposed to function and what we're supposed to expect of our representatives. Now, my main point, actually, before I launch in, I wrote down in the margin, norms. Part of my main point today, and I'll come back to it at the end, is it's not necessarily that there's bad behavior that is out of the ordinary. What matters is what we accept as norms. That's what matters. So it's one thing, there have always been congressmen and women who behave badly. There's a lot more congressmen who behave badly because there's a lot more congressmen, but that's not new. What matters is what we accept without comment. We do have more power than we think we do in accepting things as norms. So that's kind of what I'm aiming for here. And I'll come back to that at the end. Okay, so now, and I will say also here that part of what I'm going to be using on and off as I'm talking about Congress and representation, and I've used it before, and probably I think there's even a page from it posted on the webpage for History Matters. I'm using William Mcclay's diary. For those of you who haven't been here when I've used it in the past, William Mcclay is a Pennsylvania senator in the very first Congress who kept this amazing, amazing diary where he writes everything down, like snack foods of other people in the Senate, his dreams, the toys he buys his kids. And he writes a number of really interesting debates about highly significant things, which we wouldn't know about otherwise, which is why whenever I'm thinking about Congress, I think, oh yeah, Mcclay tells a story. So he'll be in here a little bit as a great example of, from an insider point of view, even though we're talking 1789 or 1790, he does write down in his diary what he thinks people expect of him and what he thinks he's supposed to be doing, and on both counts. That's really interesting. Okay, so not surprisingly, when we go all the way back in time, Congress, like the nation, is much, much, much smaller. Mcclay's diary talks a lot about men gathered around the stoves, the heating stoves, and talking. So it's both the Senate and the House are relatively smaller bodies. For a time, a lot of the work is being hashed out in Congress itself. Generally speaking, it's assumed that once you get a lot of committees, that represents the modernization of Congress. Obviously, early America, that's not the case yet. The 19th century, that does become the case. And in committees, that's really where law gets hashed out and the passage of laws gets worked out on the floor. Now, because Congress, it was very small at the end of the 18th century, but even in the early 19th century, relatively small. Part of why that's significant is because congressmen, and I will say congressmen throughout this until the end, because that's who we're talking about, congressmen assumed they would be responsible to their constituents because they assumed their constituents knew them and they knew their constituents. This is a really intimate world. This is a world where one member of Congress wanted to inform his constituents about what was going on in Congress. So he wrote a letter to his wife and told her to invite people to come over and read it. And that way she'd have company and people would get informed about Congress. That's how small we're talking about in this time period. But so there is an assumption at the outset of accessibility and accountability. Mcclay's diary is a great example of that because it's a diary which we assume is an absolutely private document. But in Mcclay's case, it was largely private, but he also pasted in other notes and legislation and things that he was doing as a senator. And he makes it clear in his diary that if anyone asked him what he was doing for them in Congress, he was going to take out his diary and turn to the right page and show them. So he really felt accountable to the people back home. And he really felt at various times when he felt that he didn't do his best job or he failed, he was very nervous about going home and having to face the people back there because he would be accountable to them and he would be mortified. So we're talking real accountability, and the idea that he's preparing a diary and putting things in it in case people need to actually have proof of what he did, really fascinating and really a glance at a very different kind of world. Now, even moving into the 19th century, still, Congress is much bigger and they have to ultimately expand the House, the size of the House, physical size of the House, because there are too many people and too little a space. Even then, though, most members of Congress did not have offices. They used their desks in the House or the Senate, and they used their hotel room or boarding house room, and that's pretty much where they did most of their business. Now, again, what that means is that they don't have some formal office somewhere with a staff that filters people. It means it's kind of an intimacy there that it's not that hard for people, if they're in Washington, to find them and talk directly to their member of Congress, which people did. You know, the word lobbyist comes from this time period, and for the most part, it refers to people who want something of congressmen, but the word comes from people waiting in the lobby outside of the House and Senate, waiting for these people to ask them for things. And that was very possible in this time period. You lobby, you wait around, and then your member appears and you just buttonhole them and ask them for something. So when you wrote a letter and demanded something, when you sent a petition, you expected a response. I spent a lot of time reading the letters of congressmen in the process of working on my most recent book. And what you see a lot of in there is letters from people back home, all kinds, so not just friends of the congressman. And the letters are all asking for things, demanding things, wanting to know things. So there's a much more direct relationship than we would ever assume now. And of course, it's a much different world, so there's a reason for that. But still, for a long time, that's assumed about Congress, and it's assumed that that's what representation means. Now, ideologically, these congressmen knew that in a small R republic, that the public matters in a way that it doesn't necessarily matter in a monarchy, right? That in a republic, the public has the power. The public puts people in office and takes them out of office. You have to appeal to and get the approval of the public. And in the really early period, in the Mcclay period, people were really unsure what that meant. They didn't know who the public was. They didn't know how they were supposed to find their opinions. This might be a topic I approach actually another time. But this was a constant thing going on in the very early period, but it doesn't stop. This idea that somehow or other you should be interacting with the public in a way that is formal and that represents your job, but how do you do it besides writing letters to your wife and telling people to visit her? So that relates to a larger question, which is, who are congressmen supposed to be in relation to the public? Who are they? Are they like direct representatives who are mirroring their constituents and are there as their servants in a way? Or are they their betters who are somewhat above them and are still responsible to their constituents, but are not necessarily as immediate and representative? And I know I've talked before about the little excerpt I'm about to read here. I didn't read it before, and I want to read it because there's a little bit of power in it. It's an excerpt from Mcclay's diary, and it's about an argument over the salary that members of Congress should have. And of course, in this case, they're talking about the Senate. But the salary of senators obviously has a lot to do with who these senators are, how they relate to the people. Are they sort of higher and mightier, or are they directly representing people? So just a little tiny bit here about what this argument sounds like. And I'll remind you, Mcclay sat there and took notes while people were talking. He used a kind of shorthand. And he wrote sometimes in Latin so that people couldn't look over his shoulder and see what he was writing, and then worked on it at another time so that it was legible. So he's being very assertive about this. Anyway, so this is Mcclay. This is August 25th, 1789, which is a Tuesday. Okay. So Mcclay writes, "Now came the compensation bill," so the bill about salaries. "I moved the wages to be $5 per day. I was seconded by Elmer, but on the question, only he, Wingate, and myself rose. Mr. Morris almost raged, and in his reply to me, said he cared not for the arts people use to ingratiate themselves with the public, meaning, yeah, you're asking for a low salary because you want the people to like you. Like, oh yeah, I don't want a large salary. Look at how much I'm helping the public. In reply, Mcclay says, I answered that I had avowed all my motives. I knew the public mind was discontented. I thought it our duty to attend to the voice of the public. So I actually think I'm supposed to really be representing them, and they're not going to want us to have high salaries. Mcclay goes on, I had been informed that the average of the wages of the old members of Congress was little better than $5 per diem. I wished to establish this as a principle. I would then have data to fix a price on, as the old wages were never complained of. Morris, Izard, and Butler were in a violent chaff. This is the part that's quite interesting. Mr. Morris moved that the pay of the senator should be $8 per day. Up now rose Izard, said that the members of the Senate went to boarding houses and lodged in holes and corners and associated with improper company and conversed improperly so as to lower their dignity and character. That the delegates from South Carolina used to have 600 pounds per year and could live like gentlemen. Butler rose and said a great deal of stuff of the same kind, that a member of the Senate should not only have a very handsome income, but should spend it all, which is just wonderful. He was happy enough to look down on these things. He could despise them. He doesn't need the money. But it was scandalous for a member of Congress to take any of his wages home. He should rather give it to the poor. Mr. Morris likewise paid himself some compliments on his manner and conduct in life, his disregard of money, and the little respect he paid to the common opinions of people. I want a high salary. I want to maintain the dignity of senators, and I don't care what the people think. I'm going to do what I think is right for the Senate. It's very different from Mcclay's point of view. Mr. King got up, said the matter seemed of a delicate nature, and moved for a committee. This is wise, to whom the bill might be referred, and this obtained, and a committee of 5 were appointed. By the complexion of the committee, it would seem the Senate wants their wages enlarged. I answered Mr. Morris in a way that gave him a bone to chaw, but I believe it as well forgot. So he has something to say to Morris. Morris and Mcclay are the 2 Pennsylvania senators. But I love that conversation because it's so dramatically, some of the things being said there are so extreme, right? Not only should we have a high salary, but we should spend it all so that we look like senators and we're treated like senators. And we should act like senators. The fundamental debate there is, who are our representatives supposed to be? Are they supposed to be our betters? Are they supposed to be a mirror of us? Are they supposed to do what we want? Are they supposed to do what they see best? At certain times, in certain ways, as far as those last 2 points, there could be different answers. So we can't assume that we know everything that's going on and that we can guide every decision of our representatives. On the other hand, they represent us and our wishes and our demands, and that matters a lot. Now, in all of this equation of representation, obviously the press is a major part of the relationship between constituents and their congressmen. Congressmen, it's very clear, and again, my study takes me up to like the Civil War, and then after that I start to peter. But certainly in all the period that I look at before we get more complicated technologies, congressmen knew they were being watched. They performed to a certain degree. They would sometimes say things before the press and then quietly go off to the person who they'd insulted and said, maybe you and I could figure this out. Not all the time, but sometimes. So they certainly were talking to the public. And that conversation, they assumed, again, like everything else I'm talking about here, they assumed that conversation would be intimate. And an example of that is at some point, and I want to say that it was in the probably 1830s or 40s, I can't remember, maybe the 1830s. There's an instance in which a representative stands up and says something, and he gets a few days later a petition from people complaining about some of the things he's saying and asserting that they want something different. And the congressman replies to the petition on the floor during debate and says something like, who are these people? They're like common people who have no idea about what's going on here. Like, why should I listen to this? And because newspapers printed enormous amounts of congressional debate in their pages, the people back home heard how they were being referred to, and they wrote back a new petition. It was like, your constituents do not think this is how they should be referred to by their member of Congress. It became an actual conversation in which the people back home wrote back and knew he would get what they said. You know, he was held responsible for what he said. There was a lot more give and take. And as I just suggested, the newspapers, if you ever go and look at a newspaper from the 1830s or 40s or 50s, the degree to which they are dedicated to congressional debate is actually really striking. The president is not at the center of press coverage at that point. Congress is where the action is. And there would be maybe not entire debates, but close to entire debates transcribed in the newspaper. And not only that, but people really read them closely, which I always found fascinating. At some point in my last project, I found a publication. I may have mentioned this before. I feel like I mentioned it somewhere recently. A publication, it was like a humor magazine called Vanity Fair, which has nothing to do with ours. And it was just making fun of politics. And it happened to begin at a point when Congress was really behaving badly. But a regular feature in Vanity Fair was this sort of comic supposed moment in Congress that was composed entirely of little embarrassing statements that people made over the course of the last week or two. So basically, to read this and think it was funny, you had to know what the debate all around it was. So it's a joke that relied on the fact that the magazine assumed that, of course, people would know what was happening in the debates. You know, it's the reason why congressmen in this period would go to the press and want to read the coverage of their speeches before they got put out in the newspaper, because they really needed to be accurate. So that's kind of a different world when it comes to accountability, when it comes to accessibility. And those two things, accountability and accessibility, are obviously at the key, at the heart. They are the key. They are at the heart of representation. Very early on, when Thomas Jefferson was talking about the fact that the government's going to be in Washington and that's going to be far away from everybody else, and how can they assure that members of Congress are going to be honest and are going to represent the interests of people who they represent, he says, and I don't have the exact quote here, but this is from memory. He says something along the lines of, if we can't see what they're doing, so in other words, if there aren't newspapers reporting in some way what's going on, it will be the most corrupt body on the face of the earth, because there will be no accountability, because no one will know what they're doing. So from the very beginning, accountability, accessibility are at the core of representation, because there is supposedly a direct tie between us and the people who represent us. Now, obviously, in the 21st century, that's very, very different. We're talking about an entirely different world, new technologies, a vastly larger Congress, a huge committee system, many, many things that make a direct comparison like this not entirely useful. But the larger point about accessibility and accountability, that holds true. You're supposed to be able to assert to your representatives in one way or another your demands, your wishes, your interests, and they are supposed to consider them. However that happens, whether it's a staff of people, whether it's making a phone call and getting put on a list, in one way or another, that exchange is supposed to happen. Now, nowadays, and as I said at the outset, we're kind of in the middle right now of a moment when people are saying, why did this particular senator, when his state is in crisis, decide to seemingly go on vacation? We're having a debate about what representatives in Congress are supposed to do. There have always been bad behaving members of Congress, all the way back to the beginning, members of Congress who actually, and they're all in Mcclay's diary, all the way back to the first year the government is in existence. Mcclay talks about, and actually also Benjamin Brown French, the clerk of the House in the 1830s, 40s, and 50s. They talk about members of Congress asking for travel fees that they don't deserve, trying to buy books on the government dime, using the congressional franking privilege, free mailing, excessively for themselves. You know, in one way or another, representatives are always kind of finding a way, not everyone, to use the system on their behalf. So that's forever. That's not something new. But as I said at the very outset, part of what matters is not that there have always been congressmen who behave badly, but it's what we accept as norms, what appears to be normal or what we don't object to. Something that happens and it's allowed to happen and there's no real response of protest. And with that, we are making a statement, and others as well, about what is acceptable in our system of government and what we expect or don't expect from our representatives. Now, I want to say at this point, because I'm like sitting here complaining about members of Congress, I want to say that particularly in the recent past, I've been interacting with a good number of members of Congress, and I want to say that there are many really public-spirited, dedicated members of Congress. So by my talking about this, I don't mean to imply that somehow Congress is corrupt. There are members of Congress, perhaps, that we need to talk about, but there are some members of Congress who do what they've been elected to do, who feel responsible to their constituents and the public. That matters too, right? We can say that's a norm that we like by electing them and re-electing them, but there are many public-spirited members of Congress who I want to acknowledge. But that said, there are many who are not. Just in the recent past, we've seen members of Congress hiding from their constituents, refusing to meet with them when tough issues are up for debate, lying to constituents, assuming no accountability, right? If there's a contentious issue up for debate and the member of Congress knows it's contentious and his or her constituents obviously want to talk about it, like healthcare, if you deliberately make yourself unavailable to your constituents, that's a problem. Right? That's an issue. That's not in the spirit of democratic small d representation. So part of why I wanted to address this today was to make that point, which is bad behavior in and of itself is bad. And I'm, of course, on Twitter talking away about how representation is supposed to work. Equally important right now is what we accept as norms. Now, I can't sit here and offer you the magical solution to, if we do this and it'll all be fixed. I wish I could, but I would then not be a historian. I would be a brilliant pundit of some kind. But what I can say is it matters what's happening around us. And we need to work to do things to make it clear that these aren't norms. And whether that means making a fuss, contacting other members of Congress, going to the press, back in the days when John Quincy Adams was in Congress, people who were not his constituents would send him anti-slavery petitions, knowing that he'd talk about them, even though he didn't represent them. And they were right, he would. So we need to do whatever we can do, and that includes protecting voting rights to ensure accountability and that people understand what the norms are in representation in the American government. It matters. It's the absolute heart and soul of any democracy and of our republic. Voting rights, representation, accessibility, accountability. And those things are all up for debate right now. There's a reason why we're feeling so contentious about politics all the time. Certainly I am. But the reason why we do is because of the utmost importance of these things. So I lay this out there, as I often do on History Matters, and so does coffee, as a thing that has a lot of current relevance and that has a long history, but that really needs to be paid attention to right now. That's always been part of the aim of what we do here, has been to use history to highlight something that's going on now that we really need to think about and that we might not know the history of. So that is what I've done today with representatives. I am going to turn things over to Matt so we can open things up for questions. I'm also going to remember, so those of you who are new, every week, so we've been doing this for almost a year, and every week I have a mug that, fix my view here, I have a mug that represents or touches on something that we're talking about. And I managed to do that today. And I remembered it. I know Carol Lee, I got an open chat here. Carol Lee is usually the one that says, Yes, sounds like a mug. Joanne, you forgot the mug. I remembered this time. And I'm not going to have to explain this one at all.
Well done.
Representation of it being really cold during the inauguration, but yeah, I did beat you, Carolee. I feel very accomplished. It's Bernie and the mittens. So yes. Okay. And now Matt, of course, always does an appropriate background. We know what this one is, although Matt, I will still, you have the floor to talk about your thoughts about the background.
Well, I chose this, obviously this is Federal Hall in New York City. This is the new site of the old site of the first House of Representatives. And this is why it was chosen for today, because we're talking about representation, and thought this would be an appropriate way to honor that. I will say, now that I'm looking at the picture and how it's sort of framed on my green screen behind me, it's feeling like a very desolate space compared. Like, I feel like I'm just sitting in this kind of like dark hall, like, you know, it's but that's what the background is this week.
And I will say, actually, if you can see to Matt's left, on the floor, there are these little round discs, right? On the floor of the original, now you've hid them.
Yeah.
But at any rate, my larger point is, on the floor of what was the original house, there are like plaques about significant things. And one of them just notes where John Quincy Adams' seat was in the house. And I sort of love that. So what the times that I've been there, you know, given I just wrote about largely that room for 17 years, I always walk around and I'm like, here's John Quincy Adams' seat. This is where Benjamin Brown French sat. That's where Henry Wise picked a fight with James K. Polk. So anyway, it is a little desolate looking, but still.
And really, can you blame him for picking a fight with James K. Polk? Like, James K. Polk is just, no, I'm just kidding. I'm just making jokes.
Emily, the plaques are for members who became president. Thank you. This is not a thing I ever thought of.
Excellent.
I am educated by my community eternally. Thank you.
See, it's a back and forth in this. We learn from you and you learn from us. Hopefully, that's what we aim for. Well, we're heading to questions. Okay. As always, we have 11 questions in there already. I see a couple from somebody who is known as anonymous attendee, and appreciate it if you would actually put your name in. That's really helpful to sort of give credit where these questions are coming from. And but it looks like you all are going to rescue Joanne from my questions today, but we'll see what happens. So our first question, I think it's a good one to start with. Gina wants to know, was there an ethics committee in early Congress?
Not in the early Congress. There wasn't. I mean, you have Mcclay in his diary saying, that's not right. You had people talking about it and you had discussions about such things, but the degree to which the really early Congress is precedent setting in everything. I know I used Mcclay's diary to talk about the inauguration of George Washington and how no one knew what the heck they were supposed to do. Do we stand? Do we sit? So there were certainly ideas about ethics, but I think the sort of guarding over ethics became more organized and systematized over time.
So interesting question here. And for what it's worth, this is something that I've actually been talking about on social media a little bit lately, which is term limits. What do you think of term limits? Do you think that they're useful? And I'm happy to, I might chime in here because there's a great report from the Citizens Research Council here in Michigan about our term limits, which is germane to this conversation. But
interesting.
But term limits. What did you think? What do you think? What did the founders think?
Well, I mean, generally speaking, the founders liked rotation in office, and they liked it explicitly because they knew, like Mcclay, anyone who can't stay in office for too long knows that whatever they do, they're going to be responsible for it back home. So that was seen as a kind of check or balance in the larger system. So generally speaking, you know, term limits and rotation in office would have been seen as a good thing. Obviously, when you're talking about Congress, that's counterbalanced by the fact that you don't want a new Congress, every Congress, because people need to know the history of what's going on, the history of legislation, how to operate and maneuver their way through the institution. So do I think there should be some kind of term limit? I mean, off the top of my head, yeah, because I don't think people should see being a member of Congress as a career. I think they should see it as a responsibility and a duty and a job. But I don't think people should be able to be there for 40 or 50 years. I think when you do, you kind of forget, and this is speaking totally with no knowledge at all, but my assumption would be if I were that person, you forget a lot about what's going on and how the people are living back home. You get used to a lot of things that are very nice about being in Congress. So yeah, I couldn't give you any sense of what they should be. You know, maybe that means really, but you know, we could say you can't be in Congress for more than 30 years, and that would still have an impact. So yes, the short answer is, seems to me like that would be a good idea.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think you know, one of the things that, so this report came out in 2018 and it looked at sort of the 25th anniversary of the term limits in Michigan, and which is where I live. And for those of you who aren't aware, Michigan has some of the most restrictive term limit laws for state legislatures. And they found that actually when you restrict it that much, that it actually it does nothing to curb all the things that they're designed to do. Like, you know, it is still political. It's not look like a, you know, people are still entrenched in lobbying and some of those things. So that was put out by the Citizens Research Council, crcmich.org, I think is their website, which I recommend you checking out because they're a great organization, very nonpartisan. Love them. Not a paid endorsement, but it is. I think it's an important issue to talk to because there is that balance where, Joanna, I think you're absolutely right. Like, you know, when you're in Congress 40 years, it's a question of whether or not you're sort of doing a public service or doing yourself a service. But
yeah.
So there's a balance there, and it's certainly worth a continued conversation. So this is anonymous attendee, and so Natalie and Dave both said that they are maybe one of the anonymous attendees. I don't know which one it is, but it's a good question. Which is?
Okay.
I'm very loquacious today. Do we not protest about bad behavior because of partisanship? And if it's our guys, then it's okay. This sort of idea. Like, so how does partisanship play into this idea of protesting and or even, as you mentioned with Vanity Fair, sort of making fun of what's going on?
Well, it's a really good question. And I think it's very historian-like of me. There are several answers.
It depends.
That's right. It depends. There are many answers. It's complex. In part, I think right now, it's because I think many people feel so overwhelmed and unsure of how things are supposed to work and how much they can expect, that people aren't protesting as much as they can. I've seen people refer to our current times, and certainly before the semi-recent past, as a fire hose of bad, and that when you're buried in that amount of bad behavior, it becomes hard to sort of focus on it and judge it and hold people accountable. So I think that's part of it. I think this has a lot to do with what Americans think of politics, which partly comes from us and partly comes from the people who we put in office, right? Because as much as we might point to some members of Congress and say, well, you know, they're not representing my interests, Congress is representative of something. Now, it could be representative of gerrymandering, but I mean, Congress does in many ways represent us. So in the long haul, when you look at the constitution of Congress, meaning the people in it and the character of it and the spirit of it and the dynamic of it, that does change with the nation in a really representative and interesting kind of a way. Now, that said, partisanship has a huge influence over that as well. And when we've been in highly polarized times, it's not surprising to know that Congress, it's much harder for people to engage in conversation. I do think something that's worth thinking about now that is not a norm during polarized times. It has happened before, but it does not happen during every polarized time. And that has to do with members of Congress trusting each other. You know, they're in the late 1850s. Members of Congress didn't trust each other and didn't know who was armed and were worried about what might happen. And there was distrust between members, which is really problematic because at its core level, even with extreme partisanship, these people need to be able to argue with each other to do something, right? I mean, debate and compromise doesn't have to be polite. It could be really angry and extreme, but it still has to happen. But, you know, when you get to a point where people don't really trust each other and aren't really able to engage in a certain kind of conversation, that's really problematic. And I have no idea, sitting here in a studio apartment in New York, to what extent that is true right now. I know it has been after January 6th. I don't know how things are going, but that's a major issue that right now is shaped by partisanship.
So that leads into Miranda's question, which I think is equally good, which is, well, how do you deal then with representation when your congressperson is on the other end of the political spectrum? So how do we deal with that? And then, you know, should they represent everyone or the majority of the people in their district?
Repeat the question just so I'm sure I get
it. Miranda's asks, how do you deal with representation when your congressperson is on the other end of the political spectrum? And then should they represent everyone in their district or just the majority of the people in the district?
Well, you know, that is our system of representation. Ideally speaking, anyone who goes to Congress from any party would be thinking about the good of the country. Realistically speaking, it's parties that, when people vote, usually they're voting according to party, which means that one party wins over another party, and then that party gets that power. So that's a realistic thing. One would hope that although someone is there to serve their party and their constituents, that they wouldn't do something that is deliberately harmful to others who are in their constituency, right? Like you would think. So the short answer is, I think people are elected by a certain constituency. It makes sense if that's a Republican or a Democratic constituency that people are serving those people. But ideally speaking, our representatives are able to think about the larger good of the place they represent and the larger good of the nation as well. And sometimes in history that is proven true. And sometimes in history that's really not proven true.
So as you're talking, one of the things that I kept thinking about, this is Matt hijacking the conversation, as I am prone to do. I don't think there's a question germane to this, but I found it really interesting how you were describing how, you know, people were reading what their representatives are doing, and they were, you know, and there was a sort of expectation that they were just like you and I, and so I wonder if you could talk a little bit about the difference between sort of the number of people that are represented, that were representative throughout your understanding, you know, the areas where your expertise in history is, and today. We know that there are districts, Wyoming, there's one representative for all of Wyoming, which is roughly 525,000 people, but then there are people in California who represent 1 million people.
Right.
And that's literally double. That's a big disparity when you're talking about representation. So yeah. I'm wondering if you could comment on sort of what we could learn from the founding era or the 1850s, sort of about this idea of proportional representation.
Well, you know, I mean, initially, obviously, when the Constitution was constructed, they were trying to, in constructing representation, do something proportional. Now, that said, part of what they did was to count 3/5 of enslaved people, you know, because of demands by the South that wanted more than that. So depends on how you describe proportional. The part of the problem of what we're talking about here is just the pure size, generally speaking, right? I mean, certainly Western states at an early point were not very populous. And then you had New York or Pennsylvania or Massachusetts that were very large states. But some of what happened relatively quickly is that the country just grows in population, and Congress grows, expands to contain that. but there's a period at which there are so many representatives crammed into the original Hall of Representatives that they almost can't fit, right? There's not enough space.
Yeah.
So part of what we're talking about here has to do with the pace and nature of growth. I think that the idea was that representation would always be, generally speaking, proportional. I don't think the founders necessarily could have anticipated this. And I think, we're seeing people right now talk about this all the time in the press, right? And I suppose pundits talk about it on TV, that maybe we need to really rethink like the Electoral College. Maybe we need to rethink the Senate. I have no idea if that would be a thing that it is possible for us to do, but I don't think it's a bad idea ever to consider such things, to talk about them. And so as far as the conversation, talking about what is happening and what it means, and if something should be done and can be done, I think that matters.
All right, so more historical question here, which I think is a great one. Anissa, I hope I'm saying that correctly. It's not Anissa. That's interesting about John Quincy Adams being willing to speak up on behalf of someone else's constituents. What sort of response did that garner? I assume it ran along the lines of stay in your lane as much as abolitionist talk did. But did it affect how representatives thought of their responsibilities, state first and then country, as it represents the relationship between the states? So a lot there, but to sort of...
I'll start with John Quincy Adams, which is great. So I loved writing about John Quincy Adams in my last book. And part of the reason relates to actually this kind of a question. So Adams was a special kind of congressman. He had been president, right? And then went back to Congress and served in the House. He was the son of a founder, and he was also elderly. And for all of those reasons, he was not the kind of guy who you could punch in the jaw or physically threaten, or even be really, really aggressively rude to, right? He kind of, the way I put it, and in a way it's actually literal, is that John Quincy Adams was kind of bulletproof. And what that meant was he could do things in the House that others could not do, because he could get away with it. And so he did a lot of things with petitions, particularly reading aloud really outrageous petitions, reading petitions from all over the country, doing things that got him, people tried to shout him down. But it really mattered, because by putting it out there, he was putting it into debate. And by forcing people to shut him down, he was showing the country Southerners silencing Northerners. All of that really mattered. So generally speaking, I think the cause of anti-slavery certainly became a national cause and linked people together. I don't think everyone in Congress could have gotten away with reading petitions from other places. I do think he's kind of a special case, and he was really an ace with parliamentary rules and regulations. So he also really maneuvered his way in and out really effectively. There's an instance when I think there's just a vote count. And when it comes his turn to give his vote, he throws in some statement about slavery, and everyone objects, and the hall erupts, right? And they're like, "You can't do that, this is a vote." Ah! So he's standing there and the House is in chaos. And when it gets to peak chaos, he just drops into his seat, and the House just instantly got quiet. And he is seen off in his chair laughing, because he's like orchestrating the House of Representatives. So he was a master of that. And there's a reason why he was effective at doing what he did. But it does ask questions in an interesting way about the balance between representing your constituents, representing the country. And when you're talking about slavery, those are intertwined. Nothing is only sectional, because what matters to people who enslave people is the not only the existence, but the spread of it and the balance of power in the Union.
Is that relationship complicated by, again, me hijacking the conversation here, but is that relationship complicated by leadership positions in Congress? For example, the Speaker of the House representing national interests versus, and I'm use her because it's currently a her, instead of her constituencies or her constituents.
So meaning, should someone like the Speaker be thinking broadly?
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
I mean, ostensibly speaking, right? Ostensibly speaking, the person who is conducting the body, should not just call on Democrats, should not just call on people who agree with her. And objectively speaking, if a chair or speaker were to do that, people would protest and they would have a right to protest. In the 19th century, certainly in the period I write about, you see that sometimes where people who are of the opposite party of the speaker get reprimanded more often than others. There's an instance when, see if I can recall this correctly. Someone says something insulting about the president who is of the other party, and the person who is speaker objects and says, "You can't say that. Those words are inappropriate." And the guy says something like, "Hey, but so-and-so who's from your party called so-and-so an ass last week." He got away with it. I can't get away with this. So people were aware that there could be favoritism. And I think that was always a fact. But I think, as with so many things in Congress, there's a constant hum of this as a problem. And then there's extreme examples that expose a real problem of representation. This is part of what John Quincy Adams was doing, was just exposing the fact that Northerners were being silenced. Their right of representation was being silenced. So that's always really effective, right? If you can not just like, that person's not fair, but if you can say, you know what, we have all a right to X, and we don't appear to have that right now. That kind of more general assertion, generally speaking, is more effective in getting people to sort of stop and think about they themselves, something being taken away from they themselves.
Another history question from Tom McAndrew. Sorry, we have a couple Tom's regulars. Tom McAndrew wants to know, if I recall correctly, Morris and Mcclay didn't get along all that well. Many Pennsylvanians blame Mcclay for the national capital not ending up in Philadelphia. Can you speak about their relationship?
Oh, well, they didn't. They sort of got along. Yeah, there was a lot of rough edges between them because clearly they had very different views about what they were supposed to be doing and how they were supposed to be doing it. And Morris was very wealthy, and Mcclay was not poor, but was not as wealthy as Morris was. So yeah, they didn't get along. There's a lot of instances of one or the other of them sort of, having that kind of conversation like the one that I read today in the Senate. I think I've said this before in other ways. I think that kind of disagreement can be good, because I think our system is based on the fact that, as I said before, debate and compromise means that it's based on the fact that we don't agree. Like that's at the heart of our system, right? Debate and compromise means we have to talk to each other and argue because we don't agree. And that's, you need different opinions. When I teach my students about the 1790s, one of the things that I'll say to them is, yeah, you study Hamilton and you study Jefferson, and at one point or another in American history, people have pointed to one or the other and said they're right or they're wrong. And the fact of the matter is, there is no right or wrong, but what is right is that they were both there together arguing against each other, because the argument itself was important, more important than any individual in a sense. Mm-hmm. So I think this is answering the question. I've gotten all worked up and I might have drifted away from the question, but I'll stop there. And if I haven't answered it, you can ask it again. I got lost in Hamilton and Jefferson.
I thought it was about Morris and Mcclay and whether or not they got along. But I think you spoke to it using Jefferson and Hamilton as an example. There are about 20 more questions I really want to get to in our last 4 minutes. But the one I think is most appropriate to maybe end with today is based off something Jennifer says. I'm going to read her question and then I'm going to frame it. Okay. So Jennifer says, on that note, what about full representation for DC, Puerto Rico, U.S. Virgin Islands, etc., especially DC, since I don't think the founders thought that 600,000 people would call the city home? Framing this in a question that maybe we could talk about, the sort of where your work primarily lies can be marked by a dramatic expansion, as you mentioned, of land and peoples, territories and all that. So could you talk a little bit about this idea of representation for territories, colony, places that we've colonized, like Puerto Rico or U.S. Virgin Islands, or things along those lines. And so, like, what are your thoughts on that in a historical sense? This idea that places that are not states have representation, and how do we bring them into the conversation?
Well, there is a system in place for expansion and statehood, right? So
Right.
from the very beginning, there was an assumption that you have to be able to add things. America in those years wasn't imperial in quite the same sense as it would become over time. I think, and DC itself was governed by Congress and didn't have its own representatives, in part because the government was there, and that somehow or other, part of Virginia, part of Maryland made up DC, and that, again, they didn't anticipate this being a really large city with a lot of people. Speaking with no specific knowledge of the politics of this in DC or in Puerto Rico, it seems to me that based on statehood, if you're part of the United States, if you have the number of people that would be, the number of people that require a state, I think, for example, I think DC should be a state. I think they should have rights. I think that they should be able to not just speak in Congress, but demand things in Congress for their people. So anyway, so my version of that is, I think it makes sense. I understand why it's contentious, and it's partly contentious for partisan reasons. But again, I think I did an event. I don't remember if I said this last week or not. I did a public event a couple of weeks ago, and someone at the event used the phrase constitutional creativity, which I thought was brilliant. And the person said, we've lost a sense of constitutional creativity, meaning we've just now assumed it's in stone and that you can't think about how it works and how it might be tweaked. And I think that's a really interesting idea. And I think we're at a moment where we need to think creatively in a lot of different ways, not irresponsibly, but creatively, because as all of the questions here have been suggesting, things can change so dramatically over time, and nothing is more representative of that than the US Congress. So it makes sense that we should be able to have those kinds of conversations. We might not be able to do that right now, but I think it's important, and I think we should.
Well, we are at 11 o'clock, so
11
as much as I want to ask a bunch of these other great questions, we're going to have to save it for the after party. So I will say goodbye to everybody and thank you, and look forward to seeing you at the after party. And if you do like what we did here, again, please join us at our website or on social media. We can be found at www.ncheteach.org, or at HistoryEd on Twitter, or NC4HE on Facebook. We're also on Instagram, and we worked on our LinkedIn page this week. So our LinkedIn page looks a whole lot better, hopefully. So please join us on LinkedIn, and of course, make our connections there. I assume I'll get about, let's see, there's 112 people here, so I assume that I will get 108 at least friend requests tomorrow on
of course. And let me add, for those of you who are new, we now segue into the after party. What that means is that we stop recording, conversation becomes more informal, and we really chat. As I've said before, and as I know I tweet about this all the time, like a hokey person, this is a really amazing community of people that meets once a week and has been meeting once a week for a year. So the after party is a chance for us to engage as a community. If you want to be part of the after party, all you need to do is stay here. If you're following on Facebook and want to be a part of it, all you need to do is go to the link. And I guess that would be the link on the NCHE webpage, right? NCHEteach.org/conversations.
Mm-hmm.
Okay, so anyone could come, you're welcome to, and we basically just have fun for an extra half hour and talk about whatever we want to talk about. In the meantime, thank you everybody, as always, for coming, for making a conversation, a place for this kind of conversation every week during the most contentious, crazy, wild, stressful times. I will see you guys next Friday. I have no idea what I'll talk about because who knows what'll happen. between now and then. That's the weirdness of this particular show, is that I want it to be topical, and between 12 and 2 on a given afternoon, something new becomes topical. So anyway, stay safe, stay warm, and I'll see you guys next week. And as always, thank you, Matt, for being my partner in crime.
Oh, this is the best part of the week. Thank you. So.